Hey guys, Steph the Illuminated Nerd here. Today we're talking about byte versus bit, such as, let's say, gigabytes, gigabits, and you've heard those terms mentioned before. So what's the difference? What does it mean? And how does it affect your decision as a consumer? So what is a bit or a byte? So bits and bytes are units of measurement that are used to measure computer data. A bit is the smallest form of data, which is represented by like a 0 or a 1, so like on or off, like a light switch, right? And a collection of 8 bits, so 8 on or off switches, represents a byte. And a computer uses a byte to be able to store some sort of a value. So let's say even like a character, right, in a word. So it would store, let's say, the capital letter A as a bunch of zeros and ones, and then it would know that those bunch of zeros and ones refers to that the letter A has been stored to represent that. So moving on from that, when is either bits or bytes used in our daily life? They're both used to measure data or amounts of data, though there's a difference of 8 times depending on which one you're speaking about. But they're used in different contexts. The general rule of thumb is when we're talking about bytes, we're talking about storage. So disk drives, USB drives, SD cards, the amount of internal memory on your mobile device, that's all storage. And then when we're talking about bit, that's usually when we're talking about internet transfer speeds. That's usually the one place where they tend to be talking about bits as opposed to bytes. So let's go over a little bit of the prefixes and abbreviations and whatnot. When we're talking about, let's say, gigabyte, right? And you're seeing it abbreviated as GB, well, the B, if it's an uppercase B, a capital B, that means byte. But when it's a lowercase b, that refers to it as a bit. So when we look at the transfer speeds, which you can see right over here, when you're talking about transfer speeds, you tend to talk about like megabits per second, which is written and abbreviated as Mbps. But you can see that the B is actually a lowercase b in megabits per second, so that refers to megabits per second. So as I mentioned earlier, a bit is actually the smallest measurement, and a byte is 8 bits. So when we're talking about, let's say, a 100 megabits per second internet package, it will actually transfer at 12.5 megabytes per second because of that 8 power of 8 difference, right? So because that's how it stores information. So internet service providers tend to talk about bits per second because, well, for marketing reasons, it sounds nicer when they say that they want to sell you a 100 megabit per second package, as opposed to them saying they're going to sell you a 12.5 megabyte per second package, right? So that just sounds better, which is why they tend to refer to bits per second as your transfer speed. But when you're trying to download, let's say, a 100 megabyte file, and you have a 100 megabit line, internet line, then you won't be able to download that in a second. It'll take 8 seconds because of that difference of 8, right? And then when it comes to storage abbreviations, the one that you're going to see quite often is you'll see the MB or the GB or TB, right? So if you're buying, let's say, a hard drive, and it'll say that it's 500 GB, which is gigabyte, right? And when you're talking about, let's say, a terabyte, well, a terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes, and a gigabyte is 1,000 megabytes, and so on and so forth, a power of 10, right? But if you're a bit of a, let's say, a tech geek, you might say, well, that doesn't sound right. That's actually wrong, because I've always referred to, let's say, a gigabyte to represent 1,024 megabytes, because computers understand things as a base power of 2. So 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024. I'm sure you've heard those numbers referred to. So when you buy a 64 gigabyte flash drive, or 32 gigabytes, so that's where those sort of numbers come from. It's from that base 2 power. In 1998, someone thought that when we were referring to GB, gigabyte, to represent 1024 megabytes, that was confusing, so they decided to say that instead that a gigabyte should represent 1,000 megabytes because it was easier to understand in the power of 10. Not every manufacturer has sort of followed with doing that, so it's a little different depending on what industry or what product you're looking at. But they, in 98, said that instead of saying GB to represent a gigabyte that's base 2 powered, so to represent the 1024, it's actually GIB that you're supposed to say for the abbreviation to represent the 1024 megabytes when you're talking about a binary prefix as opposed to the decimal prefix. So depending on the thing is that people didn't really get used to that, and manufacturers didn't really get used to that. So even today, you're going to buy a product and it's not usually going to say GIB. It'll usually say GB, even if you're buying like let's say memory, like RAM, and it's supposed to be like 16 gigs of RAM. It should actually be GIB, not GB. But I'll explain that a little bit later. So let's move to the next part. The hard drive story. So this is an interesting one because of what I just explained, where in 1998 there was internet consortium that kind of defined that we should be referring to storages as a power of 10 instead of that jumps of power of 2. Some of the manufacturers sort of listened. The storage manufacturers tried to take advantage of that sort of change in order to make us think that we were buying larger hard drives than we were actually buying. So if I take a little screenshot, you can see that I've got 4 hard drives, 3 hard drives and a USB drive on my computer. And when you look at the as advertised section, I bought, for example, a 4 terabyte hard drive, and that's what it was advertised as when I was buying it. It said that it was 4 terabytes. And then I installed that hard drive and added it to Windows and whatnot, and when I turned on my computer says that I only have 3.63 TB, not 4 terabytes, which is what we would all expect, right? So what happened there is that because the marketing people and the storage companies sort of saw that this was happening, that they had to kind of, instead of saying 4 terabytes would be, 4 TIB, they decided to keep the TB naming convention based on what the new Internet Consortium had said. And to sort of trick us, a 4 terabyte hard drive refers to 4 trillion bytes of data, which is technically correct because 4 trillion bytes in the power of 10 is actually correct in saying that that's 4 terabytes, right? But Windows is a binary-based computer, and Windows sees and refers to your storage base power of 2, not base power of 10. So when Windows tries to tell you how much space your hard drive is actually taking, it's actually going to represent that in base power of 2. So Windows actually shows you that your computer says it's actually 3.63 terabytes, but you're actually still having 4,000 bytes of data. But if it had been, based on that old base 2 system, some of us old school people think that, oh, 4 terabytes must mean, it must mean that each terabyte is actually 1024 gigabytes, and you'd be expecting more than 4 terabytes worth of storage using that old system. But instead, because the hard drive manufacturers are using the new system, you are getting your 4 trillion bytes of data, but Windows is only going to say that it's 3.63 terabyte. So in a way, marketing has won, and they're effectively able to sell these hard drives, which we see them as being smaller than what we think that we're getting. So that's what that is. And then lastly, when it comes to actual computer memory, like RAM, the manufacturers still keep saying GB, 16 gigabytes of RAM. But it's not actually 16 gigabytes. Memory is actually base 2, not like storage that they're sort of advertising it as the base 10 numbers. But memory is absolutely dealt as base 2. And when you're putting 16 gigabytes of RAM in your computer, that's actually 6,384 megabytes of memory. So it's not actually GB. The manufacturers should actually be saying that it's 16 GIB, not because of the base 24. So you're not getting 16,000 megabytes of memory. You're actually getting 16,384. So I guess in that sense, they're advertising that you're getting 16 gigs, but you're actually technically getting slightly more than that. So because of that sort of naming convention change at some point, memory actually kind of works out to our advantage based on what they're advertising, but hard drives don't work to our advantage based on what they're advertising. So that's really it. That's the difference between bits and bytes, and somehow when we refer to them as, gigabits, gigabytes, and the little abbreviations that you see out in the industry and what they mean and how that can affect you in your everyday life, especially when it comes to like internet transfer speeds and whatnot. So I hope that you're now armed with a little more information that can help you make decisions as a consumer.